The cold never knocked. It just walked in, the way grief does, and sat down beside you like it had been invited. I've been the station agent at Hollow Pine for 19 winters, and in all that time I have learned exactly one thing worth writing down. The mountain keeps its own ledger. It doesn't care what the timetable says. It doesn't care that a woman has a job waiting for her 3 towns over, or that a man swore he'd never come down off the ridge again. The mountain balances its books in its own season, and it collects in weather. I'm telling you this because on the night the 8:40 came in 2 hours late with the snow chasing it, I watched two people who had every reason to stay strangers become something the timetable had no column for. One of them was half frozen on my platform. The other one hadn't spoken more than 40 words to another human being in 3 years. I wrote it all down because that's what I do. I keep logs. My wife used to say I'd write down my own funeral if they gave me a stub of pencil. She's been gone 11 years, and I still keep the logs, so maybe she was right about more than that. What happened next isn't the kind of thing that fits neat in a ledger, but I'll try. Stay with me. It's a long night and the fire's small, but I'll tell it true. Not the whistle, the wheels. Steel on steel, brakes locked, the whole train shuddering into the platform like a horse that had run itself blind. Snow came off the roof of the last car in a sheet and hit me square in the face, and for a second I couldn't see the train at all, only white, only the sound of it, and then the engine coughed and settled and the world came back one gray shape at a time. I had the lantern up before the conductor got the door open. "You're late," I told him. Stupid thing to say. He knew he was late. "Line's near buried past the trestle," he said. His mustache had ice in it. "We're not going on tonight, Kettleman. Not till the plow comes up, and the plow's not coming up in this." Behind him, the passengers were already the color of people who'd been cold for hours in a car with a stove that couldn't keep up. 3 men in traveling coats. A family, mother, father, 2 children wrapped so tight they looked like luggage. An old fellow with a Bible in his lap he wasn't reading. They came down the steps stamping and swearing soft, and I pointed them toward the depot house where the stove was going, and they went, and I marked them in my head the way I mark everything. 6. 7 with the conductor. Then I saw her, and I stopped counting. She was still in her seat by the window. I could see her through the frosted glass, just a shape, upright, too upright, the way a person sits when they've stopped being able to slump. The conductor followed my eyes and his face changed. "She got on at Fenwick Junction," he said, quieter. "Wouldn't take a blanket, said she was fine, said it about 4 times. People who say they're fine 4 times are never fine even once." I climbed up into the car. The stove at the far end was a poor red glow. The air inside was the kind of cold that's almost worse than outside, because outside at least the cold is honest and moving, and inside it just pools and waits. I came up the aisle and there she was, a young woman, maybe 25, in a gray traveling dress that had been good once and had been rained on and slept in since. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her lips had gone a color lips shouldn't be. "Miss," I said, "Miss, we're stopped for the night. There's a stove in the depot. Come on down where it's warm." She turned her head to me slow, like it cost her something, and she smiled. That's the part I remember. She smiled at me, polite as a Sunday, and she said, "Thank you, but I mustn't be any trouble. I'll wait here." Her teeth weren't chattering. That's what put the fear in me. A cold person's teeth chatter. When they stop, when they go quiet and polite and start declining kindness, the cold has already got its hand around something inside them. I'd seen it once before, on a section hand who fell asleep against the water tower. He'd been polite too, right up until he wasn't anything. "No trouble," I said, and I got my arm under hers whether she liked it or not, and she came up out of the seat lighter than she had any right to. That frightened me more. There was nothing to her. A satchel by her feet, I grabbed it, and a small case, and a folded coat she hadn't been wearing, which is a thing I still don't understand. A coat right there and her not wearing it. We got to the top of the steps and the wind hit us, and her knees went. I want to be honest here because I'm always honest in the log, and I'll be honest now. I couldn't hold her. I'm 61 years old and my back is a thing I negotiate with, not a thing I command. And she folded and I folded with her, and we'd have both gone down the iron steps onto the platform, and that would have been the end of it. Two broken people in the snow. Except a hand came out of the dark and caught her. I didn't see him come. That's the thing about Elia's Grange. You never saw him come. He was just there, the way weather is there. One big hand under her shoulder and one under her knees, and he lifted her off my failing arms like she weighed nothing, like the wind weighed more, and he turned his back to the storm to shelter her without seeming to decide to do it. I knew him. Everyone up the line knew Grange the way you know a landmark you never visit. He came down off the ridge twice a year, spring and fall, to trade pelts and buy powder and salt and coffee, and go back up before anyone could get more than a nod out of him. He had a beard like a thorn bush and eyes that had gone quiet the way water goes quiet when it's very deep. There was a story about him. There's always a story. I'll get to it. Depot, I said, and he was already moving. He didn't run. Running in that snow was how you fell. He walked, fast and sure, head down, and I came behind with the satchel and the case and the lantern, throwing our shadows huge and shaking against the depot wall. He shouldered the door open, and the warm hit us like a wall of its own, and every face in that little room turned. Bench by the stove, I said. Get those wet things. No, wait. But he'd already laid her down on the bench, and he was doing something I didn't expect. He wasn't piling blankets on her. He'd stripped off his own coat, a great heavy thing of oiled canvas and fur that must have weighed near 2 stone, and he wasn't putting it over her. He was working her hands out of her wet gloves, and he pressed one of her hands flat against his own chest under his shirt against the skin and held it there. Then the other, skin to skin. The whole room went quiet as a church. The mother of the family made a small sound. "You'll want to," the old man with the Bible started. "Don't rub her hands," Grange said. His voice was rough with disuse. A voice that lived alone. It came out low and it filled the room anyway. "You rub 'em, the cold blood in the fingers goes to the heart all at once. It'll stop the heart. Warm her slow, warm her center first." I've since been told by a doctor that this is exactly right. That night, I only knew that a man who lived alone in the mountains had opened his own shirt to a stranger's frozen hands and was warming them against his heart, while the whole town's worth of stranded travelers watched, and that the woman between his hands had started, very faintly, to shiver again. The shivering was good. She was coming back to a body that could still be cold. "Water," Grange said. "Warm, not hot, and someone get that stove up." I had a kettle going always. The father of the family fed the stove. The old man surprised me. He put down his Bible and knelt and started chafing her feet, gentle, through her stockings, the slow way, and I saw Grange give him one short nod, the way you'd approve of a man who knew his business. She came up out of it slow. First the shivering, which shook the bench. Then a sound, not a word, just a breath with the shape of a word in it. Then her eyes opened and they didn't know where they were, and that's a terrible thing to see. A person's eyes open on a room that means nothing to them. And then they found Grange's face, this thorn bush of a man leaning over her, holding her hands to his chest, and I braced for her to scream. She didn't scream. She looked at him and her cracked lips moved and she said, "Are your hands warm?" Grange said nothing. His jaw worked. "They're warm," she said, answering herself, wondering. "How are your hands warm?" "Fire in the stove," he said, which was a lie. The stove was 6 feet off. The warmth was all him, and everyone in that room knew it, and nobody said so. Her name was Ada Bellamy. We got that much over the next hour, in pieces, between the shivering and the warm water and the slow return of a person to herself. She was a nurse trained at a proper hospital back east, she said, and I believed her, because when the old man's chest started to whistle with the cold he'd taken helping her, it was Ada who sat up despite all of us telling her not to and said, "That's not a cold in his chest. That's his heart working too hard. Sit him down and loosen his collar." And she was right, and she talked him quiet and the whistle eased. She was traveling to take a post. There was a mining town 2 days on, past the mountains, Coldwater they call it, and they named it Honest, that had lost its doctor to the typhoid and had no one to nurse the sick, and they'd sent for anyone who'd come, and Ada Bellamy had answered because, she said, no one else did. She said that lightly. No one else did, like it was a small thing. I wrote it down that night in the log and I underlined it because I have learned to notice the sentences people say lightly. Those are the ones that cost them the most. I didn't ask her why a trained nurse from a proper hospital back east was riding a night train alone into the mountains in winter to a town that had already lost one healer to the plague. It wasn't my business. But I noticed she had no ring, and I noticed the good gray dress gone shabby, and I noticed she'd sold her coat somewhere along the way. That folded thing on the train had been the conductor's spare. I learned later that he'd forced on her. And I noticed that when we asked was there anyone we should wire that she was safe, she went still. And after a moment she said, "There's no one." In the same light voice she'd said no one else did. 2 people in my depot that night who said, no one, like it didn't weigh anything. And the storm outside piling it up against the door. Grange didn't leave. That surprised the room more than any of it. Elias Grange, who came down twice a year and left before the coffee cooled, who hadn't sat at another man's fire in 3 years by anyone's count, he stayed. He moved back to the wall once Ada was warm and steady, back to where the shadow was, and he sat on his heels with his coat back on and his hat down, and he watched the stove. But he stayed. And every little while, without seeming to move, he'd be up feeding the fire before it dipped, or moving the kettle, or handing the old man a folded cloth for his chest. Always the right thing. Always before you knew you needed it, and always without a word. I've thought a lot about why he stayed. I've had years to think about it. I believe now it was the simplest thing in the world and the hardest to say out loud. He'd carried her in from the cold, and a thing you carry in from the cold, some part of you doesn't set down easy. Round about midnight the family's children fell asleep in a pile of coats. The 3 traveling men played cards. The conductor snored. And Ada Bellamy, wrapped now in 3 good blankets with color back in her face, looked across the little room at the shape of the man in the corner and said, into the quiet, "You saved my life." Grange didn't look up. "Kettleman found you," he said. "I just carried you the last bit." "You warmed my hands the right way," she said. "A wrong way would have killed me. You knew the right way." A pause. Where does a man learn that alone up a mountain? And here is where I put my pencil down, because I did not want to be seen writing. Grange was quiet a long time. The fire ticked. The wind leaned on the window. And then he said, so low I nearly missed it, "Had a wife, and a girl, winter of '81. The girl went through the ice on the creek and I got her out, but I didn't know. I rubbed her hands. Rubbed 'em hard, thinking I was helping. I know now what I did." He stopped. "The wife took the fever after, nursing her, and I couldn't, there was no one. 2 days' ride to anyone and the pass shut, so I learned it after. Learned everything after, when it was no use to me." Nobody breathed. "That's why I know the right way," he said. "It's the only reason a man learns a thing like that, too late." Ada Bellamy looked at him across that room for a long moment, and she didn't say "I'm sorry," which is what everyone says, which is the useless thing. She said something else. She said, "Then it wasn't too late because you knew it tonight and I'm here." She held up her 2 warm hands, turned them in the firelight, living hands. "These are because of what your daughter taught you. She's in this room right now in a way. That's not nothing. That's not too late." I've heard a great many things said in 19 years of stranded strangers around my stove. I have never heard anything that went into a man the way that went into Elias Grange. He put his hat lower. His shoulders moved once. And nobody looked at him, because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a man is to look very hard at the fire. The storm broke near dawn. That's the mountain for you, 3 days of threat, and then it just quits, sulks off. And the sun comes up on a world so white and clean it's almost an insult, like nothing had happened, like no one had nearly died on my platform. The plow would come up by noon, the conductor reckoned. The line would be clear by afternoon. Everyone would go on to wherever they'd been going. I stepped out to check the switch and Grange came out behind me, and we stood a minute in the terrible bright cold. And I said, because I'm a nosy old man and I'd earned one question. You heading back up the ridge then? He looked up the mountain. His whole self was pointed up that mountain, 3 years of it. His traps were up there, his cabin, his solitude, the graves I now understood were up there too. And then he looked back at the depot, at the window, where a young woman in a gray dress was helping an old man with a whistling chest sit up to take some broth, moving around that cramped little room like she'd been born knowing where the sick and the frightened needed hands. She's going on to Coldwater, Grange said. It wasn't a question. Where the typhoid is. That's the post, yes. Alone. Says there's no one, I said. Grange was quiet. Up the mountain was his whole life. Down the line was a plague town and a woman who'd walk into it because no one else would. Coldwater's past the high pass, he said slowly. Pass'll be bad after this. She won't make it 2 days on that road alone, not this time of year, not without she knows the country. He worked his jaw, not without someone who knows it. I said nothing. 19 winters have taught me when to say nothing. I know the country, Grange said to the mountain, to himself, to the cold, clean morning. I know every pass and every creek and every place the road washes out. He let out a breath that smoked. God help me, I know the way. And that was the moment. I marked it in the log. I've still got the log. That was the moment a man who'd sworn off the whole living world stood in my station yard and decided, without one soul asking him to walk back into it. Toward a plague. For a stranger. Because he knew the way and no one else did, and that turned out to be the one argument Elias Grange had never learned to say no to. I didn't know yet what it would cost him. I didn't know what waited in Coldwater. I only knew, standing there, that the mountain's ledger had balanced strange that night, and that the snow that had nearly killed Ada Bellamy had, in the same stroke, thawed something in a man everyone had given up for frozen. The plow's whistle came up faint from down the valley. He went in to tell her. I wasn't there for the road to Coldwater. I want to be clear about that, because I've kept honest logs my whole life and I won't start inventing now. What I know of the second part I have from 3 sources. From the conductor, who saw the start of it. From a freighter named Das who caught up to them at the high pass and rode a day in their company. And from Ada Bellamy herself, who came back through my station 4 months later and sat by my stove and told me the rest, because she said I'd earned it, having been there for the beginning. So this part isn't the log. This part is what I stitched together after, but it's true. I'd staked the mountain on it. They left the morning the plow cleared the line, not on the train, though. That's the first thing that surprised the conductor. Ada could have ridden the rails most of the way and taken the road only for the last stretch. But Grange looked at the timetable and shook his head. The train would drop her at Fenwick, and from Fenwick, the road to Coldwater went over the high pass. And the high pass after that storm was no place for a woman alone with a satchel, train or no train. He'd take her the whole way overland on horses, the way he knew it. She had no horse. He had one plus the pack mule he'd brought his pelts down on. So he sold his pelts, a whole autumn's trapping, his living, his reason for coming down at all, sold the lot to the general store at half what they were worth because he took the first price offered and wouldn't haggle, and he bought a second horse with it. A season's work gone for a horse to carry a stranger to a plague. Das the freighter told me that part, told it shaking his head like he still couldn't credit it. Man sold prime beaver for a sway-backed mare, Das said, and looked happier doing it than I ever seen him look selling for a fair price. Beats all. They rode out. Ada told me she tried that first day to thank him again, and he waved it off the way he waved everything off, and she learned quick that Elias Grange couldn't take thanks. It slid off him. It embarrassed him. It seemed almost to hurt him. So she stopped thanking him with words. She thanked him other ways. She noticed when the strap of his pack was chafing the horse and said so before a sore could start. She had willow bark in her nurse's kit and made him take it when she saw him favoring an old knee on the climbs. She talked not at him, but around him, the way you talk to a shy animal, giving him the room to answer or not, and slowly, over the miles, he answered more. By the second day, she said, he was telling her the country. This creek floods in April. That ridge holds elk in the cold. Here's where a man built a cabin once and the mountain took it back. He knew it all. 3 years alone up there, he'd learned the land the way some men learn scripture, and he'd had no one to tell it to. And it came out of him now in a slow, steady stream. And Ada Bellamy, who was walking toward a town full of dying people, because no one else would listen to every word like it was the first kindness she'd been shown in a year. Maybe it was. She told me some of her own story that day by my stove, and I'll tell you a little because it matters for the end. She'd been engaged back east. A doctor's son, respectable, and she'd trained as a nurse partly for love of the work and partly because it pleased him to have a useful wife. Then the diphtheria came through the ward where she worked, and she nursed through it when others fled, and she took it herself and near died of it. And while she was near dying, the doctor's son decided a wife with a scar on her throat and a weakness in her chest was not the wife he'd pictured, and he married someone else before she was even out of her bed. And the hospital, when she recovered, had filled her post. And her people were gone, mother and father both, years back. And so there she was, a trained nurse, alive against the odds, with a scar at her collar and no place and no one, and a notice on a board that said a mining town called Coldwater needed anyone who would come. No one else answered, she told me, and I understood that. I understood being the one no one wanted. So I answered. It seemed like the right work for a person nobody was waiting on. If I died there, no one would grieve it, and I could do some good on the way. She said this without a scrap of pity for herself, which is the only way it's bearable to hear. I thought I was going there to disappear, she said. I didn't expect to be carried off a train by a man who'd learned to save my life too late to save his own. They came to Coldwater on the 4th day, and Coldwater was worse than the notice said. It's always worse than the notice says. The typhoid had run through the miners' shacks and the boarding houses, and there was no doctor and hadn't been for weeks, and the sick were being tended by the barely well, and the barely well were falling sick in their turn. The dead were in a shed because the ground was frozen too hard to dig. When Ada Bellamy rode in on a sway-backed mare bought with a trapper's whole winter, they nearly wept at the sight of her, and she was off the horse and into the sick shacks before she'd shaken the road out of her skirts. Here's the part I've turned over most. Grange could have left. He'd done what he set out to do. He got her there alive over the pass, which no one else could have. His debt, if a rescue makes a debt, which I don't think it does, but if was paid 3 times over. Up the mountain was his cabin and his solitude and his 2 graves and the whole quiet life he'd built out of grief. He'd been away from it 4 days, the longest in 3 years. Every reason he had pulled him back up that ridge. He stayed. He stayed in Coldwater through the worst of it. Ada told me he didn't nurse, he couldn't. He had no training, and the sight of the fever-sick shook him in ways she understood without asking, because she knew now about the wife and the girl and the fever that took them while he could do nothing. He couldn't tend the dying, but there was everything else, and he did all of it. He hauled water. He chopped wood, mountains of it, to keep the fever fires going, because a sick body needs warmth and there's no medicine like a warm room. He hunted and brought in meat for broth, because starving people don't fight fevers. And when the ground finally softened enough at the low end of the valley, it was Grange who dug the graves alone, because no one else had the strength or the stomach, and he'd had practice at graves, and he did it so the sick wouldn't have to look at their dead lying in a shed any longer. He did the work that a person does when they can't save anyone but can't bear to do nothing, and I understand that work. I think most people who have lost someone understand that work. It's the work of hands that failed once and are trying, forever after, to be of some use. The typhoid burned itself out through the spring, the way they do. It took a fair number. It would have taken far more without her. Ada Bellamy nursed that town through the worst weeks on almost no sleep, and she pulled through cases that had no business pulling through. And the day the last fever broke and no new one came up to take its place, Coldwater, rough as it was, a town of hard men and harder luck, Coldwater tried to give her money it didn't have, and she wouldn't take it, and they didn't know what to do with a person they couldn't repay. They knew what to do with Grange, though. A miner offered him a share in a claim. Grange turned it down. The town offered to build him a house if he'd stay on as their hunter and woodsman. He turned that down too, and everyone assumed then that now it was truly over, he'd go back up his mountain, back to the graves and the quiet, having done his good deed and then some. I'll tell you what Ada told me, word for word, because it's the part I think of when the nights get long. She said that on the morning Grange meant to leave, she walked out with him to where his horse was. And she didn't ask him to stay because she'd learned you couldn't ask that man for anything, he'd only give till it killed him and never for himself. So she didn't ask. She just said, "You told me once you learned to save a life too late to use it. You've used it now, twice over. Mine and everyone in this valley you kept warm and fed through the worst of it," she said. "Your daughter's in this whole town then. In everyone still breathing. That's a lot of her to have left in the world." And she said Grange stood there holding his horse's rein a long time, looking up the mountain the way he always did, that whole 3 years of grief pulling at him. And then he did a thing she said she'll never forget. He let go of the rein, just opened his hand and let it drop, and the horse stood there, and he said, rough, quiet, like it was being pulled out of him against his will, "Reckon the graves'll keep. They've kept 3 years. They'll keep a while more." And he looked at her, this thorn bush of a man who'd carried her off a train, and he said, "You'll walk into the next plague town too, won't you? First notice, you see. No one else answering." "Someone has to," she said. "You'll need someone who knows the country," he said. "The passes, the creeks that flood." "I will," she said. "And there's no one," he said, using her own word back at her, gentle, "who knows it like I do." That's all he said. That's how a man like Elias Grange says the biggest thing he'll ever say. Not a word of love in it. Just, "You'll keep walking toward the sick because no one else will, and you'll need someone who knows the way, and I know the way, and I'm tired, God help me, of walking it alone toward nothing but graves." They came back through my station 4 months after that first night. Together. On their way to some other hard town that had sent out a notice no one else would answer, Ada to nurse it, Grange to get her there, and haul the water and dig what needed digging. She sat by my stove and told me all of it, and Grange sat in the corner in the shadow, exactly where he'd sat that first night, and fed my fire before it dipped, and said almost nothing, and looked, I thought, like a man who had finally set down a thing he'd been carrying up a mountain for 3 years. I asked her, nosy old man, I'd earned it. I asked her, were they married? She laughed. She had a good laugh, that woman, all the more good for how close she'd come to never laughing again. "No," she said, "I don't think Elias is a marrying man, and I'm not sure I'm a marrying woman anymore after the last one." Then she looked over at the shape of him in the corner, feeding my fire, and something went soft in her face. "But we know the way to the same places," she said, "and neither of us walks it alone now. That's more than marriage some days. That's the whole thing, really." They went on the next morning. I watched them ride out, her on a sway-backed mare, him on his horse with the mule behind. 2 people pointed at a plague town because someone had to be, and neither of them alone. I've never seen them again. That was years ago. I don't know if they're living or dead. In their line of work, walking into the towns everyone else runs from, I'd not bet heavy on old age. But I don't grieve it if they're gone. A man who walks into a plague to be of use, beside a woman who does the same, and neither of them alone at the end of it, that's not the worst way for the ledger to close. That's not too late. She taught me that, sitting right there where you're sitting. It's not too late if you use the thing you learned, even once, even for a stranger, even in the cold. I put my pencil down now, the fire's small, but I wanted it written true so someone would know. A lonely mountain man carried a freezing nurse off my platform one winter night. That's how it starts. Where it ends, I couldn't tell you.